Today in the EU, how Austria's new leader could test Europe and what Brussels can do to push back. The bloc of populists within the European Union might soon expand to include Austria. The leader of the Freedom Party, Herbert Kickl, is likely to become Austria's next Chancellor, and until recently, even his own party thought it was too extreme for the job. Now, his rise comes at a crucial time for Europe's security concerns, especially given the politician's favorable stance towards the Kremlin. But Brussels has more than one tool to retaliate. So how did Austria get here in the first place? And what might Kickl's leadership mean for the future of the country and the Union? Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU. For the first time ever, I'm joined in the studio by our new editor-in-chief here at Euractiv, Matt Karnitschnig. Hello and welcome to the podcast.
Hi there.
So, Matt, Herbert Kickl, the leader of the populist Freedom Party, is likely to be Austria's next chancellor. But Austrians went to the polls more than 3 months ago. So between now and then, there has been a series of political plot twists that has unfolded. How did we get here?
Well, the way we got here is that the other parties in Austria, and there are not as many parties in Austria as there are in a number of other European countries, such as Italy or the Netherlands. There are only a handful of parties, really. And those other parties have made it pretty clear that they had no intention of collaborating with the Freedom Party. They didn't want to go into a government with them, given the party's profile, its anti-EU stance, for example, its anti-immigration stance. So they really tried to build a coalition themselves. Three of these centrist parties, the center-right party, the People's Party, the Social Democrats, and a liberal party called the Neos.
I am pleased to inform you today that we have concluded the exploratory phase and are formally entering into government negotiations with the SPO and Neos.
And that's why this process has taken so long, and it broke down last week when these three parties failed to reach an agreement.
Yeah, so why did negotiations fail in the first place?
The central problem is that these parties are ideologically disparate. They're not really on the same wavelength or even close to being on the same wavelength in many respects. The Social Democrats have taken more of a leftward turn in recent years. The Neos, the Liberal Party, they want more tax cuts and more market-friendly policies. And the center-right party, the People's Party, they want a tougher stance on migration. They also want more economic liberalization, which wasn't really in tune with what the Social Democrats wanted. So it was really hard to mesh these three parties, and it's very similar to what Germany experienced recently with its so-called Ampel coalition, the traffic light coalition there, between also the small liberal party, the Free Democrats, the Greens, and the Social Democrats, which broke apart because of similar difficulties in bringing all of these parties together under one tent and keeping them there.
Yeah, it seems that the goal to enforce a so-called cordon sanitaire is not enough to keep a coalition together.
I think it's going to become increasingly difficult because the pressures, especially on these center-right and center-left parties, are so great from both ends of the spectrum. They're being pulled in all of these different directions, and it's hurting their standing amongst these voters, amongst the general public, because in many cases, there's a sense that, well, why don't you just go ahead and drop the cordon sanitaire, the firewall, as some people call it, and collaborate with the far-right party, the populist party, in whichever country it is, because clearly a large part of the population wants these people to be in power. So it's a very difficult position for the traditional establishment parties.
Yes, and I think that in Austria, the conservatives' difficult position has led to a series of missteps. We've seen how throughout the campaign, the former leaders of the conservatives, Karl and Hammer, committed to enforcing a cordon sanitaire, meaning no alliances with the FPO were on the table. Then he had to resign once negotiations fell through. And the new leader of the conservatives, Christian Stocker, says that now he is open to talk. I mean, at the same time, it's not like the Freedom Party has never been in government. It has been part of a governing coalition 3 times at the national level since the 1990s. So why would Kickl becoming chancellor make that much of a difference? Where's the concern coming from?
Austria is a more complicated case than many of the other countries we've discussed in Europe in terms of populism, because it has a very long history of populism that began in the 1990s with a man called Jörg Haider, who was a very charismatic figure, who was kind of like an Orban-esque figure in Austria, who pioneered really a modern form of right-wing populism that has become very common since then. And in fact, Herbert Kickl was an acolyte of Haider's. He was a speechwriter for him beginning in the 1990s. And when that party really took off then, it was because of a similar issue to today. The central issue was migration. At the time, it was migration from the former Yugoslavia into Austria, which Haider used to galvanize people against the political establishment at the time. And he was so successful that by 1999, in the general election that Austria had that year, the Freedom Party finished second and really shocked the world, and especially shocked the European Union and the other members of the European Union. There were only 15 members at the time, and they responded to the success of this party because they ended up entering the government, as you said at that time, the governing coalition, together with the People's Party. The other 14 EU members responded by imposing what became known as diplomatic sanctions against Austria, basically meaning that their ministers refused to visit Austria for bilateral meetings. That didn't last for very long, but it is worth remembering that episode to just understand how far Europe has come since then. I mean, today, of course, we have Meloni in Italy, we have the success of the Rassemblement National, and we have the growing success of the Alternative for Germany in Germany. So, what's happened in Austria really kind of set the stage for what we've seen elsewhere in Europe. What makes Kickl so controversial, however, and though as you say, Karl Nehammer had refused to go into negotiations with him, and the reason is because Kickl is, for many people in the political establishment in Austria, both on the center-right and the center-left, really beyond the pale because of comments that he's made over the years about foreigners, about the president of Austria. But at the end of the day, I guess the new leader of the People's Party, Christian Stocker, he himself was opposed to dealing with Kickl, and now he's done a 180-degree turn. And the reason for that is that they are worried that if they don't do this, that there will be new elections. And currently the polls in Austria show that the Freedom Party, which won 29% back in September, would get about 37% if there were new elections. So this is a real disincentive for the political center to open the door for a new election, because they would be weakened and ultimately the Freedom Party would emerge stronger.
And that's really impressive. I mean, these figures really speak to the Freedom Party's ability to rise from the dead. The far-right party was at the center of a so-called Ibiza scandal, which caused the government to fall in 2019. And 5 years later, the FPÖ is the most supported party in the country.
Herbert Kickl!
You've been covering this extensively, so what has been the key to the party's success? Is it because voters are more forgiving of far-right party scandals?
Well, in a word, I would say the reason is migration, that this is really the common thread throughout the history of the Freedom Party, the modern history of the Freedom Party, and I would argue the other successful far-right parties in Europe, is this issue of migration and identity politics that they have very successfully used to their benefit.
So the promise of Fortress Austria, basically.
For example, also the promise of deporting a lot of people, of ensuring that Islam doesn't take more influence in these societies than it already has, of cracking down on certain practices. Kickl once wrote a campaign slogan for the party, which would be translated as "Stick to our home, not Islam," which rhymes in German, but not in English. But the point is that Islam in particular and foreigners from the Middle East and Northern Africa have been used to really sow fear in the minds of the population. And it's been very successful. And that's why after this implosion, after the so-called Ibiza scandal, the party has emerged even stronger to win 29, almost 30% of the vote last fall, which is really an extraordinary turnaround. And that's despite the fact that Kickl himself is very unpopular. He's a very unpopular politician on a personal level. Only 2% of the people who voted for the Freedom Party in September said in exit polls that they voted for the party because of Kickl. They voted for the party because of its policies. And the policy that it is most identified with is migration.
And some commentators are saying he's the new Orban. I read your brief. You argue he is not. What degree of affiliation does he have with the Hungarian leader, and why are they different, in your opinion?
I think the main reason that they're different is what I just pointed to in terms of his personality. He's not a charismatic figure, which Orban is. And Orban is much more like Euractiv, the real godfather of the modern Freedom Party. Kickl has never been that, and I think never will be. So that is a huge difference. The other difference is that he's going to have to govern in a coalition government together with the People's Party, which won 26% of the vote. So he has 29%, they have 26%. I don't think he's going to succeed in retooling the Austrian constitution in the way we've seen Orban do. And I think the other difficulty he's going to have is that Austria is now in a period of pretty severe economic stagnation, and it doesn't look like it's going to get better anytime soon. So, he's going to have a hard time getting reelected potentially in 5 years if he can't deal in particular with the economic problems the country is facing.
And he's been accused of acting as the long arm of the Russian intelligence by the Liberal Party. Now, what should we make of this accusation? Should we resize it based on what you've just explained? And how would his positioning towards Russia affect the bloc?
Well, I think this is something that people really should be focusing on more in Brussels, is Austria's connections to Russia in general, and the Freedom Party's connections there specifically. And I have, as you said, written extensively about this. But one thing that was very interesting in Kickl's past that happened when he was Interior Minister in 2018, and this is shortly after he became Interior Minister, just a few weeks after, he oversaw a raid of the country's intelligence service. They sent the police in to raid the country's intelligence service, and they seized a bunch of material, and there are various theories about why they were doing this. But one of the things that was seized was a data bank with all of the communications between other Western intelligence agencies and the Austrian intelligence service. And a copy of that data bank has disappeared and has never really resurfaced, and no one knows where it is, whose hands it ended up in.
Oh,
and there are a lot of theories about it, but this episode ended up in Austria being isolated from this club of Western intelligence agencies for a fairly extensive period of time. So this just shows the concern in security circles about the Freedom Party, and in particular about Kickl's involvement there. And I suspect that if this government is formed, that the Austrians will once again find themselves completely isolated on the intelligence front.
And so what tools would the union have to sort of deal with the risk posed by Kickl becoming chancellor and strengthening the bond to Russia? You've hinted at it in your brief, and I was wondering, what were you referring to?
I'm referring in particular to the deficit procedure that Austria is going to have to go into because they are now in violation of the Stability and Growth Pact because their deficit is pushing nearly 4%, which is above the 3% limit.
Mm-hmm.
So that gives the Commission some leverage over Austria. And I think that Kickl, who is very focused on domestic politics, despite his very aggressive rhetoric about Europe and all of the nasty things in his mind that the EU has done to Austria, I think he's going to tread lightly with Europe. And I think he's going to focus on unfortunately going after his enemies, real and perceived, in Austria itself. But it does mean that the Commission has a bit of leverage over Austria in the coming years.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
This was Euractiv's podcast, Today in the EU. Sound design by Miriam Sáenz de Tejada and Niels de Keokelare. Research and production by Charles Cohen. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news and sign up for our newsletters. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and your favorite streaming platforms. Don't forget to subscribe and give us a review. It will really help us spread the word about our work. See you tomorrow. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.